Welcome once again to the Fall Lecture Series and Charles Longfellow's Japanese Photographs Collection. So tonight it's just a real pleasure to get to introduce our featured presenters, my colleagues, Daly and Hanson Plass. After their presentation on this really fascinating layered piece of our site's historical collections, we'll have a chance for some questions and answers. Just a reminder that tonight's talk is being recorded, and if anybody needs the restroom, the visitor center restrooms are open this evening. That's just behind the building we're in right now. So let me introduce our speakers this evening. Hanson Plass has been the archivist at Longfellows House, Washington's headquarters, and the John F. Kennedy National Historic Site since 2022, and has worked in the museum and archival collections for the two sites since 2012. Hanson Plass holds a bachelor's degree in history and biology from Mount Holyoke College and a master's degree in museum studies from the Harvard Extension School. Earlier this month, she was awarded the National Park Service's 2021 National Appleman Judd Lewis Award for outstanding contributions to cultural resource stewardship and management, specifically for her leadership around the site's Distance Transcribers Volunteer Program. Daly, the site's curator, graduated from Gettysburg College with a BA in history and holds an MA in museum studies from the George Washington University. He has worked at the Longfellows House for over 20 years, first as the museum collections manager and for almost a decade and counting as the museum curator. Before coming to the Longfellows House, David worked at Gettysburg National Military Park and at private historic sites and museums in Florida and in New Hampshire. So now I will turn it over to Kate and David.
Actually, I'm going first.
David and Kate.
So thanks everybody for coming out. Small crowd, but that's fine. You can be real cozy together tonight. It's a beautiful evening, so I'm sure people have lots of other stuff to do, but we're happy to see you. So as Emily just said, my name is David Daly. I'm a museum curator. And tonight, Kate and I are going to talk a little bit about the site's collection of 19th century Japanese photographs. I'm going to give some context to the collection and discuss how it was created, who acquired it, how it came to the house, and then I'm also going to speak a little bit about some of the prominent photographers whose work is represented in our collection, and then Kate's going to cover the digitization project of these images, including some of the hows and whys of what has been done, as well as, I believe, talk about some of the challenges that are involved in having that process completed. So, let's just dive right into it, and if I can figure out this computer. There we go. So this is the guy who is basically responsible for it all. This is Charles Appleton Longfellow, eldest child of Henry Wadsworth and Fanny Appleton Longfellow, born in 1844, and often referred to by the family as Charlie, which is how I'm going to refer to him, even though I didn't know him. And like I said, I've been here more than 20 years, so I feel like I kind of do, so I'm going to be a little familiar with him. He grew up as a bit of a departure from the rest of the family. His primary interests appeared to be shooting and hunting, guns, sailing on yachts, boats in general, and traveling the world, as opposed to many of his other family members, extended family, who were really focused on literature and art. In 1863, Charlie, then 18 years old at the time, essentially runs away from home to join the Union Army. He fights in the Civil War, and his military career is quite brief. He was wounded seriously while fighting in Virginia in November of 1863. So the 159th anniversary of his wounding is coming up or something. As an aside, the jacket he was wearing when he was shot through the back was part of our Civil War exhibit this season, so I hope you got a chance to come see it. It's sort of one of the marquee pieces of our Civil War collection with the bullet holes through it. After his military service and the earlier deaths in 1861 of both his mother, Fanny, and his grandfather, Nathan Appleton Sr., he inherited a sizable fortune, and after his military service, he spends the rest of his life traveling the world, with two of his most notable trips being extended visits to India in 1868 through 1870 and Japan, the subject of this talk, from 1871 to 1873. And so these four images are just some examples of photographs he had taken of himself during some of his various trips. Over on the far side, we have Charlie in Paris, 1864, and then 1867, he spent some time traveling in Eastern Europe, Russia, with his mother's half-brother, Nathan Appleton Jr., and a shot from India, and then another one taken in Hong Kong just after he left Japan. Okay, let's see. Just a few examples of other photographs that he collected. Charlie was always interested in acquiring photographs during his trips. Here are just a few examples of ones he picked up while in England. See that Stonehenge. The one from Russia is a Russian soldier all bundled up against the cold, presumably. And India, this is Emperor Akbar's mausoleum in Sikandra. He writes about seeking out photographs in his journals as well. In 1866, when he's in England after a transatlantic trip in his uncle's yacht, the Alice, he writes that the day after they arrived, quote, "We spent the day rushing about London, found some splendid pictures of yachts, and invested largely." This is going to be a theme. He spends a lot of money on photographs. He has the money, and he's very free with it. He also acquires photographs, of course, in Russia the following winter, but his collecting really kicks into high gear during his trip to India in 1868 to 1870. Another quote from a letter he writes to his sister Alice: "Having grown reckless as one always does just before leaving a country, I bought $300 worth of India photos yesterday." So if you're wondering, that's an amount roughly equivalent to about $6,500 today, in today's money. So this is the last full day he spends in India, and he's frantically trying to collect as much as he can, and he just drops that amount of cash in one photo studio in Calcutta just before getting on the boat to leave. And at the time of Charlie's trips to India and Japan, photographs as souvenirs were still very much a luxury item. Many of them had a very complex process of creation that involved chemicals, fragile glass plates. A lot of these photographers were taking heavy loads of equipment and needed a lot of porters to help them to get to some of these places they were photographing. So they weren't necessarily cheap, easily bought items. Also, being an avid and early buyer of photographs invariably meant that Charlie collected many examples of work that were done by pioneering photographers, since it was still a very new commercial industry. This is something he did in India, but this really continues and expands in scope upon his arrival in Japan. So most of the photos from Charlie's Japan collection that we have today are mounted in albums of varying sorts. We'll show you a few shots of them. And many of these he annotates himself, adding the names of people and places. There are also many individual photographs, including some small carte de visites and larger framed pieces. But all told, there are well over 300 individual images in the collection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the most important and significant photographers who were operating in Japan during Charlie's stay, both Westerners and Japanese photographers. And this is the first person we're going to talk about, Felice Piatto. And to be clear, this photograph is not part of our collection. I've got images of the 4 photographers I'm going to talk about, but those 4 are not part of the Longfellow collection. Everything else you're going to see is. So this is Felice Piatto in 1866, a few years before Charlie gets to Japan. Piatto was an Italian-British photographer and one of the first, at least known, to take photographs in East Asia. His influence in Japan, where he both taught and worked with many other photographers and artists, is particularly deep. He moved to Japan in 1863, where, oh, I'm touching the screen here, I'm going to mess things up. So he moved to Japan by 1863, where he forms a partnership with English artist Charles Bergman, or is it Bergman? Bergman, thank you. It's called Piatto and Bergman, Artists and Photographers, and it operated from 1864 till 1867, and it was one of the earliest and most important commercial studios in Japan. Piatto traveled to areas that very few Westerners had previously been, and in addition to his conventional subjects, he photographed some more sensational matter, such as severed heads of executed criminals and other rather macabre images. But his photography is really known for its quality. It's fairly rare today to find pieces, and also for the way he treated Japanese subject. He was fairly respectful of them, whereas others, Western photographers, were not always treating them in quite the same sensitivity. In October of 1866, a fire that destroyed much of Yokohama also destroyed Piatto's studio and many, or maybe even all of the negatives they had at the time. So this is probably part of the reason that his work is relatively rare in the market today. And also in 1869, he attempted to retire from working as a photographer and instead delegated the work to others within his Yokohama studio, which then became titled F. Piatto and Company Photographers, which was run with assistants and primarily Japanese photographers and artists. So Piatto was the first photographer in Japan to sell complete albums of his works. And around 1870, or by 1870, their sale had become the mainstay of his business. Although customers earlier would select the contents of their own albums, Piatto later moves towards offering these pre-assembled ones that they could just basically take off the shelf. Many of the photographs in his albums were hand-colored, a technique that in his studio successfully applied the skills that Japanese artists already had to European photography. This is one of Charlie's albums, the cover on the left, and this one is assembled in a traditional accordion format, and I think later on Kate's going to show you a picture of that actually opened up so you can get a better idea of what that means. And this is not one of Piatto's pre-assembled albums. It seems that Charlie had this put together himself, or that he hired somebody to put it together for him. But it appears to follow the general form of Piatto's pre-assembled albums as far as the pictures that are included and somewhat the order that they're in as well. The inscription, this one's interesting because the inscription in this calligraphy actually phonetically sounds out Longfellow's song, so Charlie had personalized that one. And in the image on the right, you can see two photographs. Charlie actually labeled both of these. I know it's really hard to see from your vantage point, but at the top right of each, in little block letters, Charlie's inking in little captions to tell you what they say, what they're about. The one on your left reads, "An officer and wife winter dress," and the other, "Tea house servant." Apparently the albums that Piatto offered off the shelf had much lengthier, more detailed captions. But you can also see in this one, I mentioned the hand coloring, the one on the right has some hand coloring on the woman's outfit there. Our next picture, this is a portrait of Charlie, and if you look down in the lower left of the image, you can see it's F. Piatto and Company, so this was probably taken at the studio when Piatto was sort of attempting to be retired from photography and having one of his assistants or one of the Japanese photographers that was working for him doing it. Just as a personal aside, I don't think this is a very good photograph of Charlie. He looks a little dopey there. I don't know. He might have been out carousing the night before at a tea house. So Piatto's other business enterprises, when he attempted to retire from photography, apparently did not work out. And eventually he returned to being an active photographer. And in fact, he serves as the official photographer with a United States naval expedition to Korea in 1871, taking some of the earliest known photographs of Korea, which Charlie acquired, and we don't have them in our collection, but they have been dispersed, but they do still exist in other institutions. In 1877, Piatto sells most of his existing stock to another firm, Stillfreed and Anderson, which then takes over his studio as well. And following that, Piatto retires again from photography to concentrate on a career as a financial speculator and a trader. And in 1884, he leaves Japan for good, making stops in Egypt and England before he sets up yet another photography business in Burma. But eventually he returns to Italy and dies in Florence in 1909. So this image right here is of Charlie Longfellow's house in Edo, now Tokyo. This is something that he would have had specially commissioned because it's of his own living place, so the photographer would have had to come there as opposed to Charlie going to a studio. So it was taken on site, and in fact Charlie actually mentions the plan to have this happen, to have the house photographed. He writes in a July 19, 1872 letter to his youngest sister Annie, "I meant to write you an elaborate description of my house, but I'm going to have a photo taken of it soon, and I'll send it by next mail if possible with full particulars." So he followed it through. And so he's definitely collecting photos for his own sake, but he's also sending quite a few back to his family in letters to help illustrate what he is seeing, what he's doing, what he's experiencing while in Japan. And I'm going to move on to our second photographer, Raymond Von Stillfreed, also known as Baron Raymond von Stillfreed-Ratnitz, was an Austrian military officer, and he is another very early photographer to operate professionally in Japan. His photos of Japan following the end of the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1870s are now appreciated both for their documentary and artistic value, and are found in lots of international archives, obviously including our own. So this picture from about 1875 shows Stillfreed in his Japanese studio, and presumably this is one of his assistants sitting on the floor there next to him. After his military career, Stillfreed travels around the world, going to South America and China, but he comes to Japan for the first time in 1864. Interestingly, he does not arrive here as a trained photographer, but rather he gains the skills and knowledge of photographic processes after his second trip to Japan in 1868, when he worked for Felice Piatto. In 1871, he opens his own studio in Yokohama called Stillfreed and Company, and that continues operating until 1875. So that is the company, the Stillfreed and Company, that Charlie would have known and done business with during his stay there. And this is one of Stillfreed images of Charlie, obviously commissioned by Charlie in the studio, of him dressed as a samurai, taken in 1872. This is possibly the most used image from our collection, from our Japanese collection. It's been used for book covers and exhibits and lots of other purposes. As I had just earlier mentioned about Charlie sending photos back to his family in letters, this one as well is sent to his sister Annie, where he writes that, "I send you a photo of a gentleman of Kyoto," but he's referring to himself here. It's an interesting comment because it speaks a bit to the extent to which Charlie's really trying to immerse himself in Japanese culture. And I'm just going to make a quick plug on our next temporary exhibit. For next season, we're going to be featuring some highlights from our Japanese collection, objects and textiles. So if you get a chance to come see us next year, please make sure you get into the gallery to see all of those items. So objects like this, photographs like this, were obviously highly sought after by foreigners as souvenirs. But Charlie is really going an extra step here by dressing up in full regalia. And in fact, the outer garment, the however he's wearing, is a piece that we do have in our collection, and we hope to have that on display next year as part of that exhibit. Now here's another one that Charlie had commissioned. This is taken in September of 1872 on Charlie's return from his ascent of Mount Fuji. Pictured are Charlie, he is the Westerner on the left, with the brimmed hat there. His traveling companion, Alfred DuPont Jessup, who was a wealthy businessman from Philadelphia, whose family fortune apparently derived from paper mills. And it is believed that one of the Japanese men in the photo, possibly the one on the left, is Yoshi, Charlie's attendant, who is often referred to in his journals from Japan. So Stillfreed would have taken this picture, like I said, in 1872. In 1873, the Vienna World Exposition takes place, and the Japanese government actually commissioned Stillfreed to travel to Hokkaido in northern Japan, where he took photographs documenting the process of the country's modernization, which Japan at the time was very eager to display to the rest of the world. And he also made images of the ethnic Ainu people, whose way of life was being particularly impacted in a negative way by this push to modernize Japanese society. In addition to being a photographer himself, Stillfreed trained many Japanese photographers. In 1876, he sells most of his stock of negatives and photos to his protege, a Japanese photographer named Kusakabe Kinde. And then in 1881, Stillfreed leaves Japan to live in Vienna, where he received an imperial and royal warrant of appointment as photographer. So he maintains his involvement with photography even after he leaves Japan. Now we're going to go into a couple of the native Japanese photographers that are represented in Charlie's collection. This is, oh, I took the wrong page there. Ueno Hukoma. This picture is taken in 1868, probably in Nagasaki. Hukoma, born in 1838, is a pioneering Japanese photographer. He's especially noted for his portraits, his photographic portraits, which are very often of significant Japanese and foreign figures, and for his landscapes, but especially those showing Nagasaki and the surrounding area. Ueno is both commercially and artistically successful photographer, and he was also known as an instructor. His father was a merchant who in 1848 may have actually been the first person to import a camera into Japan, even though he wasn't a photographer himself. And in 1852, Ueno enters the Nagasaki Medical College, but he does it to study chemistry in order to help him run the family business as opposed to becoming a doctor. And in 1857, he starts studying under a Dutch naval medical officer named Johannes L.C. Pompa van Meerdervoort. It's a mouthful of a name. who also instructs Ueno in photography in addition to the medical studies. Later on, Ueno contacts a Swiss photographer named Pierre Rossier and decides to pursue a career in photography himself. Rossier worked in Japan as a photographer from 1859 to 1860, and while in Nagasaki, he's teaching photography, including the wet colloding process, to Ueno and other Japanese photographers. And then a few years later, Ueno co-writes a textbook that includes an appendix dealing with photographic methods. So he's really sort of cementing an early position as one of the foundational figures in Japanese photography. He also opens his own studio in Nagasaki in 1862, and then begins importing cameras, much as his father likely did years before. Here is one of his photographs. This is Charlie again, dressed up as a character that apparently is a very common type in many Japanese kabuki plays. And it's just another example of Charlie affecting Japanese fashion. Among his photos from Japan are many of Japanese actors in their costumes, some of whom were among the most famous performers of the era. Charlie seems to have really enjoyed attending the theater while in Japan and was really interested in documenting that whole aspect of the culture. So Ueno's business grew. By 1882, he was very popular with Japanese and foreign notables, and he receives mention in Western written guidebooks to Japan as sort of the person to go to if you're looking to have a photograph taken. This patronage greatly increases his income. In fact, in 1879, Ueno even photographs Ulysses S. Grant when he visits Japan. And here is one of Ueno's Nagasaki views from 1872. We have the date because Charlie actually inked it on the back of the card there. This is a cabinet card type photograph, so this particular one is not from an album. So Ueno also had an important relationship with Felice Piatto, so you can see a trend here. There's a lot of connections. And Ueno taught many important Japanese photographers himself. Eventually he opens branches of his studio in Vladivostok in 1890, and in Shanghai and Hong Kong in 1891. He exhibits photographs in at least 2 world expositions: the Vienna Exposition of 1873, the same one that Stillfreed had been commissioned to take photographs for, and the World Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. And in fact, at that one he wins an award for good taste and artistic finish. I'm not sure what the parameters for making the award were, but that was the title of his award. And his studio in Japan operates until the end of the century. So now I'm going to move on to our 4th photographer tonight. We think, or it is thought, that this is Uchida Koichi in 1872, but the photograph has not really been positively identified. So Koichi's born in 1844, so he's actually the same age as Charlie, and he is also from Nagasaki. So Nagasaki seems to be a bit of a center for photography in Japan at the time. He was greatly respected as a portrait photographer, and in fact he is the only photographer to be granted a sitting to take pictures of the Emperor Meiji. Uchida was adopted at the age of 13 and likely introduced to photography by his adoptive father, that same Dutch doctor, Pompig van Mergenhoort, who also taught photography to Ueno. Uchida studies under Ueno Hukoma in Nagasaki, so you can really tell by now all these photographers are tightly interconnected, both the Westerners and the Japanese. Everybody's learning from everybody else, or buying their stock of negatives, or taking over their studios. So it's a fairly tightly knit group, apparently. Uchida purchases his first photographic equipment by age 16, so he's starting pretty early. And he's importing and selling that equipment by 1863 and opening his first studio in 1865 in Osaka. The next year he moves to Yokohama, and then in 1869 he moves again to Tokyo, where he acquires a reputation as the best portrait photographer in the city. Here is one of his photos from our collection. Probably a Koichi photo, not positive, but most likely one of his. Taken at about the time that Charlie probably would have had contact with him. As a result of his reputation, as I mentioned, he's the only photographer to be granted a sitting to photograph the emperor. 2 portrait sessions took place, one in 1872 And then in 1873, when Uchida photographs the emperor dressed in Western military style outfit. And this is the one that became the official imperial portrait at the time. And actually, private sale of this image was supposed to be prohibited, but lots of copies were made and circulated on the market nevertheless. And it was the last photograph made of the emperor until around 1888. So Koichi really kind of reached a high level of recognition as a photographer. So this is a pleasure boat. Charlie, we know, enjoyed spending a lot of evenings in Ueno on such boats. In another letter to a sister, his oldest sister Alice, he writes, "Our evenings have been spent drifting about on the river, which is most refreshing after the heat of the day and is most amusing as the water is covered with hundreds of boats, each one lit by a large round paper lantern and filled with pleasure seekers. I must say the Japanese know how to enjoy themselves most rationally." Obviously, this is one of Charlie's prime things was enjoying himself. So he really dove right into the Japanese leisure activities. And this photo here is a portrait of a geisha that has been hand-colored. It was labeled by Charlie Oakenson, 1872. And in fact, this is just one of several images of this woman in our collection that Charlie had. So apparently he knew her to some degree. But we know this is an Uchida photograph because on the back is the stamp from his Yokohama studio. So Uchida was very successful commercially, but unfortunately he died at a very young age in 1875, so he's only 30 or 31 years old of tuberculosis, so it kind of cut his career short. So those are the four photographers I was going to mention that were sort of prominent photographers, but we have one other piece I'm going to mention here. This is another album in the collection that Charlie acquired, and it's called the Naguchi Album, and maybe as you can see on the picture on the left of the cover, it says G. Naguchi's Yizo Album, and on the right is a shot of one of the photographs that is inside of it, that is of a trout fishery. So Charlie obtains this album, which is all photographs of the Ainu people and scenes of Hokkaido. And initially, our site, the park, didn't know much about it. All that was known were from the label on the album's cover, but quite a bit of research has been done on this in the intervening years, and it has now been determined that the photographer was Naguchi Genisuke, who worked as an interpreter and a translator, and probably learned how to operate photographic equipment while he was working on a British-assisted Japanese government mission to survey the coast of Hokkaido in 1871, which happens to be the same year that Charlie Longfellow was touring the island. It seems likely that Charlie obtained the album directly from Naguchi. They would have had plenty of opportunity to meet each other. Naguchi was based near Yokohama at the time, so close to where Charlie spent much of his time in Japan. And just the nature of work meant he had extensive contact with other Westerners. So this album is significant for being one of the earliest photographic records of the Ainu people and their culture. And as I mentioned earlier, one that was under considerable pressure from the Japanese government to assimilate. So in addition to being a record of a vanishing way of life, the photographs, even though they're not of the exact places Charlie visited while he was in Hokkaido, would have been of real interest to him as souvenirs of his travel in the region. So I think this is my last slide. But just a few comments on the significance of the collection as a whole. So Charlie's collection has importance for several reasons. One, it's a really interesting personal visual record of his extensive travel. They illustrate his trips. They bring to life the written records he left behind in the form of both his journals and the letters to his friends and family. And while his written accounts are invaluable to us, the photos that he purchased really go a long way to giving a more complete sense of what he's describing through the written word. They're also important as documentation of some of the earliest pioneering photographers to operate in Japan. Many of these photographs are now very hard to find, not only due to their age, but because of the fact that many of these negatives and the photographic stocks were lost by photographers. Fires destroyed studios or warehouses and were an all too common occurrence in the 19th century. And finally, for us, they're a really important resource for present-day researchers, whether those researchers are interested in the history of photography or as visual documentation of 19th century Japanese scenery, architecture, fashion, people, or also really as a window into how Westerners in the period viewed Japan, its people, and its culture. Because there's really, a lot of these photographs have a filter almost on them that says something different than maybe one that was taken by a native Japanese photographer. And on that note, I'm going to hand over the rest of our presentation to my coworker, Archivist Kate Hanson Plass, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the project to digitize this collection, some of the hows, whys, and challenges involved in doing that. All right? Maybe I'll just do your seat and go over there.
All right. So as David said, not only those contemporary disasters like studio fires, later destruction of cultural heritage sites and collections through war and natural disasters made these photographs quite rare, especially within Japan. Because of their production as collectible souvenirs for these well-off tourists, they do survive in US and UK collections in particular, like ours. The photographs, as David's already been showing, capture people, often models posed as types, like these two women labeled by Charlie as Kyoto dancing girls, or landscapes and historic structures like Edo Castle, which is still a historic site in Tokyo today, but other landscapes and buildings that have been altered or destroyed over time. And they are of ongoing use, active research or demand. Some of the key publications, we're going to see a theme with that most published image that David mentioned. The journals of Charles Longfellow were published by the Friends of Longfellow House in 1998 and well illustrated throughout with images from the collection. Not long after, same portrait of Charlie. Longfellow's Tattoos also uses those collected images to illustrate throughout, and a more recent work by David Brody, Visualizing American Empire. Again, Charlie makes the cover. A little more focus on his Philippine collected photos, because he does continue to collect photos from around the world throughout his travels. And even more recent use of the collection, some not yet published, include scholarship on the Ainu photographs, a search for historic photographs of a building Charlie visited in Japan and wrote about. Unfortunately, that search turned up empty. We didn't have those specific photos. And a project to gather unified descriptions of photographs into a unified catalog because of that researcher interest in collections outside Japan. We've seen this photograph before of the cover of that large album. We don't quite have the scale yet. The images collected by Piatto, both of those previous images on the previous slide came from that album. And here's what it looks like on the side and starting to open. So you see the accordion folding back and forth. Those are my hands, so you get a sense of the scale of this physical piece. And for this album in particular, because of its scale and because of that accordion nature, handling it to provide researcher access is quite challenging. To allow somebody to go through and see all of the photographs, even to want to compare photographs, and to handle it safely without adding to the wear and tear that will damage it over time. So this and the researcher interest made it a high priority for digitization, which allows us to share the images as widely as we want without that additional handling. Digitization presents an additional challenge, again because of the physical nature of this piece though. It is very challenging to translate that accordion nature, the back and forth, physical nature of it, as well as the size, into its digital facsimile. Stepping back a bit, this is an illustration of the phases we go through in a cultural heritage digitization project. Planning, digitization, processing, and finally publishing. The planning really starts with prioritizing what gets digitized and thinking carefully about what our goal is for the project. That goal dictates the quality level that we target. A significant amount of the workflow also happens in the post-capture processing phase. We track and embed metadata, descriptive material about the object into the image and make sure that that stays with it along the way. And throughout these steps, we continue to evaluate, learn, and improve our process. As we were talking about a little bit before the program started, this is not a new process at this site. The digitization work has been going on for years, and the standards keep changing because technology keeps allowing the capture process to get better and better. So we're continuing to revise our standards and improve the workflow and improve the preservation quality image. The goals of our project are not, though, to produce an image that will replace the original. The goal is definitely to improve access. And again, that dictates the target of our quality, the level of quality and quality control that we're targeting. Not getting down in the weeds of the federal agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative, or FADGI standards and the different star levels, except to say that we aspire to a 3-star out of 4-star level, but we don't actively monitor all of the very technical pieces on the bottom of the charts here, so we can't actually claim an established FADGI star level. But those best practices in the field really do inform the file formats we try to use, the image size, to get the most versatile image so that somebody can take these images and publish them down the road. Here's a behind-the-scenes peek at our in-house photography setup. This is in our research room. The albums were photographed in-house. We used a photo stand with a mounted DSLR camera, shooting in RAW to end up with a TIFF at 300 ppi for anyone who does want those weedy details. We also, you can see at the very front of the picture there, we used a scale bar and a color standard to have those available for that image quality assurance, trying to ensure that the color that we're capturing of the photograph, especially with photographs, that the color we're capturing is correct and that the end viewer will be able to see a good facsimile of the original image. And this is Evgenia, our digital archive intern, who worked with us for most of last year, and she really did the lion's share of the post-processing and shepherding this project to get these images published. Another interesting physical feature of this album in particular, and a couple of these elaborately bound albums, is that the borders and the background are flecked with gilt. So this gold reflective quality, which is a challenge to photograph and both capture and not distract from the actual photograph, which is the main focus, although as we'll see again with the final image here, we made sure to include that full border because it does include the caption that Charles Longfellow added right along the gilt border at the top. So once the image is captured, we go into the processing phase and we rename the files, correct exposure as needed, embed the original metadata, the metadata describing the original image into the file, and create an access copy into JPEG. And in this album in particular, in working through the metadata, we also were looking at the metadata with an eye to reviewing the existing language, describing the photographs so we weren't potentially perpetuating outdated or harmful language, because description changes over time, and we wanted to make sure that we were working with the best data set we could. And then publishing. Our digital archive platform is called NP Gallery for National Park. It's a digital asset system created by the National Park Service, and the Longfellow Archives has a customized portal, so users can do a keyword search, can browse, and then I've got the menu highlighted here to browse to the sub-series of albums of East Asia photos in Charlie's collections. And currently the 243 photographs from Charlie's four Japan albums, plus some additional images of the covers and some of the page spreads. You can see one thumbnail there of a collage spread that's in one of the accordion and fold albums. And these are all available to both researchers and the general public on the Digital Archive NP Gallery portal. And as David shared a few of the the individual photographs as well. There's another 57 photographs from East Asia, and that also includes Korea, Thailand, China, and some other places, are all available to browse. So far we're at about 20% of Charles Longfellow's photograph collection. We've been excluding duplicate images, which we see in some of the individual photos. He collected multiple prints, sometimes of varying qualities. So we're not going to reach 100% published on NP Gallery because we're being a little selective. But we've been targeting this as one of the priority collections. Again, going back to that researcher interest. So npgallery.nps.gov/long is where you find our digital archive portal, which is available from our website, where you can also find finding aids to all the collections. We have a link to an article specifically by Eugenia, specifically about tips for navigating NP Gallery, and of course, long_archives at nps.gov is how to reach park staff for questions, assistance, and even higher quality images should they be needed for other projects. And with that, we'll close with a photo not from Charlie's collections, but of Charlie's collections. This is the Japan room that he put together in his second floor L room of the house, collecting his Japanese material. There's probably a good number of photographs tucked away in this photo, and part of that rich collection of material that we have here today. And if anyone has any questions,
This is a
we'll open the floor.
practical question. Can you repeat the document that was created to help you navigate NP Gallery? Where is that?
It's linked from our research page.
Yeah.
So on nps.gov/long,
Yeah.
there's we have research, and then there's a specific article about NP Gallery how-to. And it includes some of the why that I've gone into tonight, some behind-the-scenes pictures, and then some of the nitty-gritty suggestions for how to keyword search that I'm not going to get into tonight unless somebody asks.
And I'll send out a link to everyone registered tonight for the NP Gallery link, that article.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Kate or David?
I got one, because I don't know the answer. So that fold-out accordion album, how far would it stretch if we put it out all the way?
Oh, I didn't look up its,
How many panels are there? I know that we don't have a table long enough to hold it.
we do not have a table long enough to hold it.
But I think that just highlights some of the challenges that Kate already addressed with researchers coming to see it. Say they want to see a photograph that's close to the center of the thing. While it does fold up and you can have it in two, to have it moved out it's a production. It's not like coming in and pulling a photo out of a sleeve and just having it right there. So, I mean, just the transportation of the thing and the arrangement of how we're going to lay it out so that it can be studied is a bit of a project in and of itself.
We discussed a little bit in planning tonight whether we should try to do a special exhibit and pull it out. It's so big, and it would, if we wanted to open it, it requires a custom mount or someone to stand there and hold it perfectly still, which is how we actually did the photography, which is why you don't see pictures of it open in here. It's right, because we have turned the pages, we have not opened it out.
Right.
So I don't know how long it is altogether.
So now that you've got the procedure established and you've got 20% sort of done, and you're continuing, I'm sure, is that funding thing, is that every year you gotta get funding for a position?
So our, I'm getting out here, it was a funded position for last year. We have another intern, Kayla is currently working in that position. We are not continuing straight through Charlie's photos. We've been trying to target high research interest, high priority collections. So I think the next things up in the queue to go on to NP Gallery are the complete portraits of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and portraits of Fanny Appleton Longfellow from the Longfellow family photograph collection. We have a set of glass plate negatives because there were photographers in the family. So there were glass plate negatives taken by Joseph Gilbert Thorpe Jr. Those are up in the queue. And then some more correspondence because we have all sorts of material types in our archive. We have some of Erica Thorpe's correspondence up in the queue next, which we've fortunately, through the dedicated work of volunteers, we're able to also provide full text transcriptions alongside those letters in particular. So more coming.
Who did you consult with to develop your whole setup with your equipment and your computers and the software and everything that you're using for editing and that kind of thing?
We have largely been doing this in-house. I'm going to call out our retired archivist. Started some of the work, the digitization work to varying standards as technology has allowed has been kind of an iterative process. We also have colleagues over at the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site who have been scanning large format plans for years, so have expertise in that and in managing those large data sets. So we collaborate with them. We've done the reading of the PAGI standards and other best practices, but we have not had we've not done a consultant, had somebody come in specifically.
And the Park Service has digital asset management staff
Okay.
in Washington, but as Kate was just alluding to, things change so fast that there's never really been one hard and fast document to follow. So a lot of it is, you know, I don't want to say winging it, but
And then there's
but you know, picking from what's available and trying to do the best practice that we can possibly achieve while we're going along. So, yeah.
But when your intern comes, is this somebody who has like digitization experience, or are they just like learning everything from square one every time?
often learning a lot on the in the position. And often coming in with classroom experience. I've been very fortunate to have two MLIS interns back to back. So bringing that active, we just learned about this in my degree kind of experience to bear on the project. But then learning how you actually execute it in the field on the job is a learning curve.
Okay, that's it. I'm just going to put one more plug for next year's exhibit, because we will be actually blowing up some of the images from this collection to use as visuals. So please come and see, because I said not only will you see some of the photographs, probably a couple that were featured tonight, but you get to see some of the three-dimensional stuff too, which is really cool.
All right, thank you, Kate and David. Thanks to all of you.